Hello, everybody. Welcome to our afternoon Tuesday webinar on issues related to the Korea Peninsula. This is going to be a very interesting session today. We have three leading experts on the nuclear arsenal that belongs to North Korea, and also on the strategy of strategies for possible scenarios for North Korea and the dynamics of Northeast Asia, what it all means and who the parties are. So during this session, you can put questions into the chat window for any of the panelists, and we'll curate those and distribute them during the Q&A afterward. It's going to be an interesting discussion. Our moderator today is Dr. Michael Jenkins, and we're very happy to have you with us. Welcome, Michael. Michael is, let me just say a few words about you. He's president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors the Washington Brief webcast and all these seminars that we do. Also chairman of Washington Times Holdings, the organization that owns the Washington Times news organization. Has led a number of very well-received fact-finding trips to Korea, Japan, and have met with legislative, executive, intelligence, military leadership in those countries. And as president of the nonprofit NGO Universal Peace Federation, Dr. Jenkins has decades-long involvement in starting and conducting peace initiatives all over the world, particularly Northeast Asia and the Middle East. So now that we know a little bit more about you, welcome, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Larry. As senior executive of the Washington Times Foundation, you do a great job. I really appreciate it. Today, ladies and gentlemen, our program is Can We Stop North Korea's Nuclear Mushroom from Spreading? Few analysts believe that North Korea is willing to fully denuclearize, and its stockpile continues to grow. A recent joint report by the RAND Corporation and the Asan Institute for Policy Studies concluded that North Korea could have 200 nuclear weapons in 5 years at the current rate of production. What are the implications of this scenario for the future? What would be the impact of North Korea as a full nuclear power on the US and ROK's Mutual Defense Treaty? And would the policy of extended nuclear deterrence be feasible for Washington and believable by Seoul? Would a move down this path cause South Korea, Japan, and other regional powers to develop a countervailing arsenal? We're going to talk about these things today with some really fine scholars and experts in the area of intelligence analysis, and really very grateful to welcome Dr. Bruce Bechtel. Dr. Bechtel is an award-winning professor of political science at Angelo State University and a retired U.S. Marine. He was formerly on the faculty of the Marine Corps Command at Staff College and the Air Command and Staff College. Dr. Bechtel served as an adjunct visiting professor at the Korea University Graduate School on International Studies. He was an intelligence officer for the Defense Intelligence Agency. He served as a senior analyst on Northeast Asia and in the Intelligence Directorate on the Joint Staff in the Pentagon. He formerly sat on the editorial review of the East Asia Review, editorial review board on the East Asia Review, and served as editor of the Defense Intelligence Journal. A prestigious scholar, an analyst, and a great thinker. Welcome, Dr. Bruce Bechtel.
Thank you, sir. And I'd really like to compliment you on the fact that you're the first person who's actually read my whole bio out loud for everybody. And it pales in comparison to the gentlemen that I'm here with today, some of whom I actually look up to as my mentors, but I appreciate being here. Full disclosure, the report from RAND in Asan in Seoul that you talked about, I am one of the co-authors of that report. So I'm going to address, I talked to Larry yesterday and he asked me to address some key specific points about the report, and hopefully my colleagues will pick up on that and you know, they can critique it a little better than they might have, knowing some of our warts. But let's just keep it between me and you and the 200 other people who are calling in today. So, first of all, my primary contribution to that report was about ballistic missiles and some about the nuclear weapons. But to be frank, the big arguments that we had were about the nuclear weapons. And again, being frank, the nuclear weapons count that we came up with, 200, was pretty conservative compared to what a lot of the other analysts came up with. So interesting. If 200 nuclear weapons in 5 years seems like a lot to everybody, that was actually a conservative estimate based on the evidence. And I would ask you to read that study from RAND. It's free. You can just go to RAND's website and download it. My primary contribution to that report was on ballistic missiles. And I just like to comment on that because the big scare in nuclear weapons is that they can be put on a ballistic missile and fired at the United States. So let me tell you, if I may briefly, what everybody knows for sure, black and white, no argument, the capabilities the North Koreans have with their ballistic missiles. They have the capability to hit Guam right now, today. They have what they call the Hwasong-12, which is equipped with the RD, that's Romeo Delta, or in Morse code, dotted it, Romeo Delta RD-250 engine, which they either stole, acquired, bought, or snuck out of the Ukraine. It was originally made in a factory in the Ukraine. That is the Hwasong-12 range of 4,500 miles. With the Nodong, they can hit Japan. They have Scuds, including the Scud extended range. They can hit every single inch of the Korean Peninsula and Jeju-do, the big island off the south of it. That means, and I would like to add, every single one of those missiles is capable of being equipped with a warhead. We have not seen that warhead because they haven't shown it to us, of course, but it's probably a highly enriched uranium warhead. For example, the Hwasong-12 is estimated to be able to carry a 1,000 ton HEU warhead, which we know the North Koreans have the plans and blueprints for because they got those from the Pakistanis who got them from the Chinese. The big debate has been, can they hit the continental United States? Now, I will tell you, my assessment is yes, not being a moron. But there are some people who think that that's not possible. So let me explain that. I'm just kidding about the moron thing, by the way. Let me take a drink here. The Hwasong-14 is essentially a two-stage missile using the Hwasong-12, that RD-250 engine-based rocket, as its first stage. And the Hwasong-14 can probably hit Alaska and the West Coast. The Hwasong-15 is assessed to be capable of hitting the entire United States. They have been tested, the Hwasong-14 twice, the Hwasong-15 once. Both tests were successful. The difference is one can go farther than the other. There was a film that the Japanese took of the Hwasong-14 on fire as it came down. That does not mean it was an unsuccessful launch. It just means it was on fire. A nuclear-equipped missile, as the last stage is coming down, it doesn't matter if it's on fire or not. It matters if that fire gets through the shell of the second stage. So we will never know for sure whether North Korea actually has a missile capable of hitting the United States with a nuclear warhead until the North Koreans actually test it. God hope that never happens, but the only way to know for sure is if the North Koreans launch that missile to some empty part of the Pacific Ocean with a nuclear warhead and it explodes in some empty part of the ocean. So, we're just going to have to wait and see. But right now, based on the evidence, it looks like they do have the capability to hit the United States with a ballistic missile capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. And again, we won't know until they do it. Now, how do we stop that? And we told our friends at Asan this. In my opinion, the best way to do that is for the ROK, South Korea, to join the US-led ballistic missile defense system. They have not done that. They have their own system, but it's an attack system. It's not a missile defense system. They call it the KAMD. That's not a missile defense system. We also have some THAAD. We have a THAAD system over there, but that's not enough to protect ROK civilians and ROK cities. And everybody knows South Korea is a very, very populous country. So that's my solution for that. As far as the nuclear weapons development goes, just very quickly, because my time's about up, my suggestion would be, do we really want to shut that down? Then keep one thing in mind: sanctions work. We should not forget about the sanctions. The sanctions that we have on them right now cause their oil program to lose 67% of its profits. It is hurting the North Koreans right now, our sanctions. So keep that in mind: ballistic missile defense and sanctions, and I'll just let it stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Bechtel. Excellent. Our next panelist today is Mr. Doug Bondo. Doug is a senior fellow at the prestigious Cato Institute, specializing in foreign policy and civil liberties. He worked as a special assistant to President Ronald Reagan and editor of the political magazine Inquiry. He's a prolific commentator in the public square, writing regularly for leading publications such as Fortune magazine, National Interest, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Times. Also, Doug's articles are also seen in periodicals like Foreign Policy, Harper's, National Review, New Republic, and in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Doug's La Prensa, Economic Freedom and the Press, syndicated by Copley News, won the Mencken Award for Best Editorial for op-ed. Doug speaks frequently on ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, and Fox News. We're very honored to present him here today. Welcome. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. I really appreciate the opportunity to appear. I thank the Federation and the Foundation for organizing this, and it's a great pleasure to be on with my fellow panelist. Bruce, I've known for many years, and it's great to be able to talk to him here electronically, and I have watched Grant Newsham on a number of videos, so it's nice to make that connection as well. You know, North Korea is always going to be a great challenge, unfortunately, and a conventional North Korea has proved to be an extraordinary challenge over the last 70 years. It caused a war back in 1950 that was utterly devastating to the peninsula. It's caused enormous amount of instability over the years since then. And the possession of nuclear weapons adds a new dimension, which is, I think, quite frightening for us. And the question is how to deal with that. No one really wants the North to have nuclear weapons other than North Korea. You know, successive presidents have said they can't have them, but they do. You know, and the estimates of how many weapons we think they might have vary widely. I've seen estimates running up to 60. You know, we don't know. We don't know exactly how much material has been used, et cetera. Nevertheless, they clearly are a capable, potential nuclear power now, that we have to recognize that as a reality. And the question is how to confront that. And the report that Bruce contributed to, that Rand and Hassan came out with, shows the danger that if we see them move forward with essentially unconstrained production, we find a very different kind of nuclear power. If we talk about 200 nuclear weapons, if you look at the current estimates for nuclear powers, the US and Russia are far ahead with thousands of weapons. But if you look at the other nuclear powers, this would put the North into pretty much the same category as everyone else. Estimates that I've seen have about 300 nuclear weapons for France. China, a bit over 300, clearly building up its arsenal. We're not sure where they're going, but they are clearly moving upward. United Kingdom is a little over 200, the estimate at least that I saw. Pakistan and India under that, and Israel under that. So if you take these numbers, and North Korea at 200 nuclear weapons, would put it right in the middle of the kind of secondary nuclear powers. And 200 nuclear weapons can do an extraordinary amount of damage against a number of countries, not just the ROK in the US, but other countries in the region. Imagine Japan certainly, and others, quite extraordinary. I think the question we have to deal with is, how does this affect both the US policy of extended nuclear deterrence and also the US alliance relationship with the ROK? Since World War II, with the nuclear age, the US has had what we call a nuclear umbrella over a number of allied countries. The view is, during the Cold War, we said we would use nuclear weapons to defend Europe if we needed to. The Soviets never tested that. Everyone presumed that we were serious. In Asia, it's long been viewed the US has a nuclear umbrella over at least Japan and the ROK, and there's some questions raised about how much further might that extend, whether in Australia or even at Taiwan. You get into much more controversial area there, of course, and even questions the Middle East with Israel, though Israel has its own nuclear deterrent. And extended deterrence works only if we view the interest as being vital, and frankly, we're willing to use nuclear weapons, and most important, that the other side believes that. That is, the idea of extended deterrence is not to get into nuclear war, it's to deter war. So you want the other side to believe that if they acted, whether with a conventional attack you couldn't handle otherwise, or if they use nuclear weapons, the US would respond with devastating force. And that, I think, was believable, especially with Europe in the Cold War. The question is, does that still hold? And it's both sides of those, I think, are very important. And what happens then if the answer is no? Suddenly we find a world in which Europe is not the concern today. I don't think anyone really believes Russia plans nuclear war against Europe, but we really have moved to Asia. I mean, question of China and issues of Taiwan, but North Korea and I think South Korea is probably the most dangerous. And one can imagine looking at this saying it's harder to make the case that South Korea is vital to America's existence. It's not an existential threat to the US. We don't believe the North would use nukes against us. So how do we view South Korea in that context? And the problem is North Korea is not only a conventional power, suddenly it has nuclear weapons, which means it could attack the US in response. So I think that raises questions about the viability of extended nuclear deterrence in Northeast Asia. And the second is the question on the alliance. For South Koreans, extended deterrence is an important part of that alliance. They view that as being integral to it. They rely on that. Back in the 60s, Park Chung-hee was interested in nuclear weapons. The Nixon administration shut him down. Part of that was a commitment behind that the US was there with its own nuclear weapons. And the problem is extended, again, it's not just a conventional threat by the North, but the North, if it acquires an ability to hit the US, and already it could hit Guam, it could hit the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, it could hit Okinawa's, the bases, which have a Marine Expeditionary Force and other units there. And if we believe it can hit the United States proper, is suddenly put that in a different realm. The question is what to do with that. And I think North Korea is not suicidal. North Korea, thankfully, is rational. But a rational North Korea might find itself in a situation where it's willing to use nuclear weapons. And to me, the real issue for us is, does this give the North greater confidence and allow it to be more confrontational? And does it allow it to consider that it might be able to win a war or at least achieve some war aims, even if it can't get everything that it wants? And that, I think, is extraordinarily dangerous. And I imagine a situation, for example, where in 1950, the North goes to war and it loses, or it's about to lose. The US is advancing on the Yalu, and China saves it. I don't think China would intervene in the future and save it. But you could imagine a North with nuclear weapons announcing that unless the US and allied forces pull back, that it is prepared to use nuclear weapons. And the question then is, how would a president respond? Would the US be willing to accept the risk of nuclear weapons hitting not only Asian partners like Korea and Japan and American territories there, but also the American homeland? There'd be an enormous pressure on the US and allies to pull back. It changes the whole dynamic of a conflict on the peninsula, as well as America's involvement in it. And the question, does that risk calculus get so great that the US decides it's unable to maintain that? Is the alliance viable under those situations? And I think our challenge is there are no good options out there. It's long been said that North Korea is the land of no good, no answers. There's no good answers. What do? We don't want it to have nukes. The problem is we've said that for 30 years and we're at a point where it does have nukes. So how do we respond to that? What happens to the alliance? What happens on the pressure on allied countries if they want their own nuclear programs? And the question is, how do we try to halt it? I think war is not an option. That to actually initiate military strikes, I think, be far too dangerous. Bruce has mentioned sanctions. The question is, will sanctions stop them from moving forward? Then the question is negotiation. But again, I think most people don't believe they're willing to give up all of their nukes. Are they willing to make a deal? Are they willing to top off the program? Are they willing to halt? And I guess the one question is, to what extent can we get China more involved? There are lots of reasons. I don't believe that China controls them, but at the moment, China doesn't have much reason to help us. The overall US-China relationship is bad enough. They're not going to do us any favors. They don't want chaos on their border. And frankly, they don't want a united Korea allied with America with US troops on their border. So the question is, how could we get them involved? I don't think they wanted a North Korea with 200 nuclear weapons. So maybe that's an impetus that we can use with them, but what else will it require to get a cooperative relationship? So I think what we face here is a challenge. I think it's important that we recognize this may be a challenge that grows exponentially. At the moment, 200 nuclear weapons, and I think it's 2027, as the report at least suggested, seems a long time away, but frankly, we're going to find ourselves there very quickly. And I'm very concerned about that future. We need to be thinking today, what more can we do to try to stop this from happening? And if not, how do we respond to that new world? And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Doug. Excellent. And very, very compelling. We have a very difficult challenge ahead with the amount of nuclear development in North Korea. And that's why many experts do not believe that they're going to easily denuclearize, or may never even denuclearize in any way, with tremendous sanctions and so forth. So we're going to talk about that. Happy to present at this time our good friend, Mr. Grant Newsham. Grant is a senior fellow with the prestigious Center for Security Policy. He's also a research fellow at the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies, focusing on Asia Pacific defense, political and economic matters. He's a retired colonel of the United States Marine. He was the first U.S. Marine liaison officer to the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force. He has a deep background in intelligence, having served as reserve head of intelligence of Marine Forces Pacific, and was the U.S. Marine attaché for the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo on 2 occasions. Welcome, Grant. Thank you for participating today.
Well, thanks very much. I always appreciate the opportunity. I'll just jump right in with a few comments about the subject regarding the implications of a very heavily nuclear armed North Korea. It's obviously not good. My sense is that really for the North Koreans, it's just an engineering problem at this time. They will be able to develop nuclear weapons, more of them, better capabilities, and also the delivery systems to go with them. So if the trend continues and if it's not interrupted, as I said, it's just an engineering and manufacturing problem. I would note that their apparent development of submarine launched missiles is particularly concerning. What would the effects be of this kind of armed North Korea on the US-South Korea alliance? It would obviously stress the relationship. There is a point at which just any country, South Korea is no exception, just comes to have doubts about how much the Americans are willing to do. There would perhaps even be some pressure on South Korea or temptation to develop their own capabilities. One recalls about, maybe it was a decade ago, when the North Koreans launched artillery assault on some South Korean islands near the border. And the South Koreans wanted to respond in force, and the Americans apparently ordered them not to, forced them not to. That apparently did not sit very well. So one can imagine that the prospect of North Korea building its arsenal, its delivery capabilities, is something some South Koreans may not take well at all. Also, there's an issue of South Korean domestic politics. I think the vast majority of people do support the alliance with the Americans and the US presence, but there is a radical element in South Korean politics that has considerable power sometimes, like today. And they do have their doubts about the usefulness or even the value of the US-South Korea alliance, almost seeing it as the thing that keeps the two countries separated. But that is an issue. But I would also note that, on the other hand, that while the idea of a 200, say North Korea with 200 nuclear weapons is a serious thing, that at the same time, North Korean conventional capabilities could cause already about the kind of damage to Seoul and the surrounding environments that a nuclear weapon would cause. And if you think about it, and that actually has not brought down the alliance. So the alliance is fundamentally sound enough, I think. But if we do see a change, as we've talked about, I think it could stress it. And there would be, I think, some doubts on the South Korean side. So the US is faced with the need to convincingly demonstrate its commitment. Would that in fact be persuasive? I don't know. I really have no idea. There is a point at which a promise, no matter how often it's given, just is no longer believable. And there's also the issue of US domestic politics and domestic considerations. And if the US doesn't seem as committed to extended deterrence, I think our partners are going to pick up on that. Would a more heavily nuclear armed North Korea, what effect would that have on regional nations to develop their own nuclear weapons? I think they probably would eventually. I think, as I mentioned, the South Koreans must be tempted, but Japan in particular, I think, is watching this very, very closely. And I would expect that they would move along with a nuclear weapons program. They've recently said in their latest white paper, and they've been saying it for years, that North Korea is a clear and present danger. And they use even stronger language than that. But the Japanese are very worried. And I think that there is a point at which they're not going to restrain themselves. Japan also fears, and this doesn't get a whole lot of discussion, they do actually fear the prospects of a unified Korea that has nuclear weapons. And the concern is that they would turn them on Japan. So in that idea, actually, it might tempt some South Koreans from what one hears. Also, Taiwan may move ahead, may be tempted. There's an idea, well, if North Korea can get them and nobody does much, well, why not us? Other countries as well around the world, one could see a lack of restraint towards developing nuclear weapons. Maybe even Australia would give us some thought. What are the prospects of negotiating limits on North Korea's bomb-making capabilities? I don't see it. This kind of regime, without the nuclear weapons, they don't have much, and there's not much reason to take them seriously. I think about the most you might hope for is to slow down the rate of development, but even then you have to, how do you enforce it? There's some serious problems with that. So just to close up, what should the Americans, the South Koreans, and the Japanese be doing? I would be leaning on the People's Republic of China. I think they're the key to everything when it comes to North Korea. And I would give them a choice between doing business with North Korea or doing business with America and Japan. But until you really apply pressure on China, I don't see much prospects for reining in North Korea. Also, as Bruce said, sanctions do work. I would submit that they've never been tried with any degree of seriousness towards North Korea. And also, I would make this a human rights issue. I think apply pressure on that score. And we should be yelling this to high heaven as to the barbarity of the North Korean regime. And say, as I said, applying pressure on them that way to further isolate them. As for the South Korea, the Korea-Japan relationship, that's sort of like the English and the Irish. Other than saying that they need to get over it, I don't have any great solutions for that. So say those are just a few ideas, and I look forward to further discussion. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite Doug and Bruce back to the main screen. And please unmute yourselves and we'll have some time for question and answers. Doug, one thing that has come up is that Washington Times recently had an article about China's threat to Japan. If there's any move whatsoever in Taiwan, they would directly strike the US bases in Japan. That was not given as an official statement by China, but was given by the former spokesman for the military. And it was all done on purpose, of course. And Doug, any thoughts on that?
Well, there's no doubt that we may have a bluff here. And certainly from China's standpoint, it makes sense to try to sow as much concern in Tokyo as possible about the consequences of working with the US in defense of Taiwan. I think that an attack would be very likely if the US used those bases. Frankly, it'd be hard to imagine that China would stand by and not try to strike at bases that have played an active role in a conflict. It's hard to know how much we have here of a bluff and how much is serious, in part because I don't believe China wants a war. China's hope is to win Taiwan without conflict. It would like to have an absorption where Taiwan accedes to some kind of overall control and accepts that. And China is going to make as much noise as it can to try to keep everybody else out. But I do think one of the dangers of a conflict with China over Taiwan is that China will almost certainly use its bases on the mainland, which means any allied attacks on them will likely lead to retaliation and escalation. And that the use of US bases elsewhere in the region probably would result in Chinese attempts to take out those bases. So it would be messy. That needs to be taken into account, especially how to defend them and how to be prepared to respond, what kind of retaliation the US and Japan would want to take in response.
Thank you. Bruce, you are an expert on the North Korean proliferation of nuclear materials and nuclear arms related materials throughout the Middle East and Africa. How much does that play a role in North Korea's revenue, and where are they selling these components and weapons?
That's a great question, and thank you for asking me that. By the way, my last book is called North Korean Proliferation in the Middle East and Africa, available on Amazon.com, Amazon.com, Amazon.com. But North Korea has actively proliferated, as folks like Doug and Grant know, and you know this as well too, sir, to Iran, Syria, and Libya before it became the split country it is, and now again to one of the sides. If you're talking about their nuclear program, just a nuclear program, they were building a plutonium reactor. It was just completed in Syria in 2007, and it basically looked like somebody had built Yanbian in the Syrian desert, which is basically what it was. And the North Korea, I'm just to preface this, I'm Jewish. So I guess the Syrians thought those dumb Israeli guys couldn't figure out when the North Koreans put a fake roof over their plutonium reactor that underneath it was a plutonium reactor. That did not go well. And it came out later in the press. Well, first of all, to get beyond that, in 2008, the DNI, Office of the DNI, gave a complete report on that and gave definitive proof that North Koreans actually did build that reactor for the Syrians, including names of North Koreans who were photographed on site. And then after that, in 2009, it came out in the German press that the Iranians had paid $2 billion to the North Koreans to build this plutonium reactor in Syria, which would have undoubtedly, in other words, people are looking at our HEU program. Let's go offshore. We'll have a plutonium program too. That was from a defector who was the deputy defense minister before he defected. So we know that in Syria, they had a nuclear program now destroyed by my cousins in Israel. In Iran, there is a lot of evidence to show that they have assisted Iran in their ATU program. But let me highlight that by saying the U.S. government has never commented on that. So if anyone is interested in reading more about what that evidence is, they can either read my latest book or they can read the article I published in Foreign Affairs in 2018. It's anecdotal evidence, a lot of it, published in very well-known papers like the Washington Post and some great sites like James. So if people choose to believe North Korea has not assisted Iran with their nuclear program, but they did assist Syria, I think that's not likely. They've assisted Iran, I think. So there you go. Those two countries, for sure Syria, and probably, in my view, Iran.
How about Africa?
In Africa, they have sold ballistic missiles to Syria, Libya again, I might add. They've sold different types of missiles, not ballistic missiles, to the Sudan. They've sold all kinds of conventional weapons, but they have not sold WMD to anybody to date except for, or WMD related, the platforms that carry it, to anybody except Syria and Libya on the African continent, thus far that I've seen in unclassified channels.
Let's talk about sanctions for a minute. Grant, if you mentioned sanctions are not really being applied to the level they could be. Can you talk about that for a minute? And also, Doug, if you could comment on that. What more could be done with sanctions and how would it work? And how are we going to stop China from, fudging on those sanctions? Like they rejected shipments of coal and increased their purchases of other things, and North Korea's revenue went up. Tell us about sanctions, Grant.
Well, I would sanction the People's Bank of China. And as I said, give them a choice between dealing with North Korea or not dealing in US dollars. It really has to be at about that level of intensity. I think that is the key point. But also, when you think about what's being done in the sanctions monitoring enforcement, and you'll see, for example, these photographs of ships transferring oil from one to another, so off of China, sort of in that area. And we see that, but when was the last time they actually seized a ship, that they actually enforced these? They stopped somebody from doing this. I'm still waiting. It hasn't happened. Additionally, North Korea is still able to operate around the world making money. And there's a lot of countries where it operates. And unless you go after that, I say give those host countries a choice. Once again, do business with North Korea or don't do it with us or our friends. And the North Korean officials still operate around the world doing the things they do to drum up the money, which keeps that regime afloat. They don't do it. And I'll just note one last thing, because I know exactly what happened. About a decade ago, the US government was offered access to every information about everything that goes into and out of North Korean ports. There was no interest anywhere in the US government in getting a hold of this access. But I've just never seen that we're all that serious about it. We talk a good game, but as I say, sanctions haven't been tried. People say, well, they never work. Well, tell the Rhodesians that, tell South Africa that. They do work, and we could make them, we could apply them, we just choose not to.
Doug?
I think there's two sides to the problem here. The first is whether, even more effective sanctions would stop the North. Would it force it to give up nuclear weapons? Over the last year and a half, in many ways, North Korea has applied self-sanctions. It's isolated itself in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's in a lot of distress right now, so it'll be very interesting to see how this pans out. Kim Jong-un is talking about a new arduous march, which is what the term they applied back in the late 90s during the famine that killed 500,000 or more people. It's hard to imagine that even effective sanctions would make the North worse off than it's been over the last year and it has chugged forward with, as far as we can tell, not much interest in talking to the US. So this is a good time in a sense that they are in economic distress. The question is, are they prepared to move through that even at very high human cost? So I'm not sure whether we can stop them from building nukes. No doubt drying up their revenue makes it harder for them to proceed forward. On the other hand, they might be able to manage even at high human cost. The problem on China is there's so many issues with China. Are we prepared to go to the brink over this? And then how does that affect our negotiations on everything else? I mean, if you're going to threaten them over Xinjiang, and you're going to threaten them over Hong Kong, and you're going to threaten them over South China Sea, you're going to threaten them over Taiwan. I mean, the difficulty is it's hard to make that work absent some kind of hierarchy of interests. And the question, at what point, what are the issues that are most important to us? What is the price we're going to make them pay? And are we prepared to try to cut them off? The difficulty with that is that, unlike the Soviet Union, China is very well integrated into the world economy. I don't think the South Koreans will go along with that. It'd be interesting if we can convince them that it is worth the price to cut China off in an attempt to try to prevent a North Korean nuclear weapon. Maybe. I don't think Southeast Asia would. I don't think the Europeans would. So it becomes much harder, and suddenly find ourselves at odds with very important allies elsewhere who would not be willing to go along with that as well. And then we'd find ourselves secondary sanctions on the Europeans if they dealt with the Chinese, et cetera. That, to me, is the real difficulty, is that China's not an easy player, to go after. This would be a huge game of international chicken. We'd have to make sure we're prepared to pay the cost, that we have the political backing, and that we have enough cooperation internationally. It couldn't be a half-assed job. It would have to be done very well thought out, with that willingness to potentially pay a very high price.
I'd like to take a moment to look at the Trump administration's policies and the results there, and we'll just open the floor for any comments there. Maybe we'll turn to Bruce first. Any thoughts on the Trump administration policy, and go ahead and compare them with the new administration and strengths and weaknesses.
Sure. Before I get to that, if I may, I'd just like to comment on sanctions. We have a lot of good sanctions in place, and I don't think Doug or Grant would disagree with me on that. The problem is enforcement. We don't enforce those sanctions the way we could have. For example, I was told by a reliable source, and I'm not kidding, that there was a couple of dozen packages, banks in China, in Malaysia, that were waiting to be sanctioned, and they were told, no, don't do it. And the other thing I would like to state about that is, you don't have to sanction a bank in a foreign country to punish it. For example, Grant mentioned, and he's correct, the Bank of China. Well, we don't have to sanction the Bank of China, but we could issue heavy fines against the Bank of China, as we did against Deutsche Bank, for example, in Europe, when Iran was under sanctions. It was very effective. Obviously China has a very different government and economy than Germany, much less transparent. But I do think sanctions are there. Sure, I think we could have more, but the sanctions would be a lot more effective if they were enforced more. And that gets us to the Trump administration. Full transparency, I'm a Republican. And, I thought he had some very good policies regarding North Korea. I think that, the pressure campaign, as it was called, was well on its way to putting real pressure on the North Koreans. And I think that came to a stop in 2018. 2018, when Kim Jong-un, which is my wife's name, by the way, and Trump met for the first time, the sanctions remained in place, but the enforcement was backed off. And it pretty much stayed that way for the rest of the Trump administration. I thought he did some good things with North Korea by leaving the sanctions in place, by lifting none of them. That's a good thing. But the thing that was disappointing about that was the sanctions that were in place could have been, in my opinion, used much more effectively.
Very good. How about you, Grant or Doug? Trump administration, Biden administration, what do you see the differences and what's happening with the current administration?
I think with I'll go to the Trump administration first. It did seem to me that that so-called maximum pressure approach was actually showing some signs of promise. And then it looked as though Moon Jae-in, the president of South Korea, sort of pulled a fast one on Mr. Trump by inviting the North Koreans to the Olympics. At that point, the Trump administration has a choice. Do you really stress the relationship with South Korea, or do you go along with it? And I think they kind of found themselves having no choice. And then at that point, maybe it was just the sense, well, what do we have to lose from meeting Kim and seeing what he's got to say? But if you watch this over a few decades, how we've dealt with North Korea, it's pretty much been a bipartisan accomplishment, I would say. I haven't seen either, except for that little bit during the Trump administration. I've just not been impressed with what I've seen. The Biden administration, I think they've had 7 months or so to run things now, and it's I can't see that they're going to do anything that really makes much of a difference. Could be wrong, but that's how it looks for now.
Go ahead, Doug. Thank you.
I'd give Trump credit at trying the approach of negotiation. The problem, of course, is that we all know that Donald Trump temperamentally is not one to engage in detailed negotiation over complex issues. That he wanted to go straight to the top when what, of course, one needed was detailed negotiations at lower levels to come up with some sort of an agreement that would have substance to it. That, my view was you were never going to have any chance of getting an all for everything kind of deal he seemed to want. But I could have imagined, and again, I think the idea, for example, of we give up Yongbyon, we want sanctions relief, could be the basis of negotiation to say, we're willing to go that approach, but we have to talk about what the exact deal is. We think you want too much. That's what negotiation is about. So you don't get that, the problem of having the president sit down with Kim Jong-un and have that come up was never going to work. And so that, I think, he was simply the wrong one in many ways to have any chance of making this approach work. I don't see much evidence that the Biden administration wants to do very much. I think in many ways they have the same attitude of the Obama administration. This is a lose-lose deal. They're willing to talk. I think they recognize not doing anything isn't much of an answer, but they don't seem to have much of a plan B if Kim doesn't seem to want to talk to them, which is so far he has pretty much rejected their initiatives as well as President Moon Jae-in's attempts to try to get things going. It looks to me like Kim Jong-un has simply decided to hunker down. They've isolated themselves. He's prepared to go through a famine in the north. They're moving backwards on reform. They're trying to close off the country. They're going after Western influence. They realize in many ways, I think that's the most danger for them in the future, is a younger generation who do not believe in the Kim family and the dynasty. And he's going to try to make it through. It's going to be rough times for them, but it looks to me like he's decided, at least in the short term, just to risk it and not to talk to the US.
Very good. On another topic related with the nuclear arsenal, what is the threat of EMP attack? We have been briefed many times that the difficulty of re-entry for a nuclear weapon is the real problem and targeting it effectively. But an EMP attack can simply be a nuclear detonation in space, and it can knock out the energy grid. Any thoughts on that? Can North Korea accomplish that? Do you think that's on their planning table at all?
If I might jump in on that one, sir. North Korea has said themselves that they have that capability a couple of times, and we've seen some evidence, though not a whole lot, that they do, in fact, let me rephrase that they are working on that capability. But we don't know how effective it would be. For example, they could launch a Taepodong, what we call the Taepodong, they call it Unha 3 now. And although it would not have to enter the Earth's atmosphere, they could release a satellite theoretically that could threaten our satellites and cause all kinds of issues. If anybody ever saw Die Hard 3, what was done there. you know, we know that they're developing that capability, but thus far, I wrote about this a bit in my last book, because Smith Richardson Foundation gave me a grant to do a lot of research on this, and one of the board members requested that I do it, and I did. And I saw some evidence, but nothing that says it would be like we had evidence on missiles, but they hadn't launched one yet. You know what I mean? So that's what I'm seeing on EMP right now. And what you said about reentry vehicles, I just like everybody to think about one thing. The North Koreans have had a successful reentry vehicle for every single kind of missile that they've ever launched. Every single kind, including the 14 and 15, the Hwasong 14 and 15. The only thing we haven't seen is whether or not they can carry a nuclear weapon on that missile to the full length instead of launching it almost straight up in the air. That's something I hope we never have to see, but it's something that if we push them hard enough, they may do. And I'll leave it there.
Good. Doug or Grant? anything?
I'll defer to Bruce on that.
Okay.
Me too.
Where are the weaknesses between the China-North Korea relationship? Historically, North Korea and the whole Korean Peninsula has been at odds with China for thousands of years. And I know that Kim Jong-un doesn't want to be under China's control or so much influence. Where are the weaknesses, and what could be done to help move that along so that North Korea would start cooperating with the United States?
Well, they aren't friends, and we saw Xi Jinping's nervousness when, after Trump arranged a summit and started talking with Kim, that all of a sudden Xi decided he needed to meet with Kim. Indeed, I think has had 5 meetings. He went years without meeting with Kim. He met a half dozen times with former President Park Geun-hye, and refused to meet with the North Koreans. So that told me that the Chinese were very nervous about being cut out. And the North Koreans have made it clear in a number of ways that they don't particularly like the Chinese. They don't like being bossed around, and they really want an option. That's the shrimp among whales. You're facing both Russia, China, and they worry about Japan. They could see America as a friend. So I think that's something the U.S. can play on. And on the Chinese side, they don't want chaos on the peninsula. They certainly don't want a large nuclear arsenal in North Korea that gives it complete independence from China and the ability to cause all sorts of harm in the region. So I think that the Chinese really don't want that. They don't want to help the U.S., but it may very well be that fear will be greater for them, and we might be able to convince them to work with us.
Bruce or Grant? China does not want the North Korea to really develop its nuclear arsenal? And if so, how can we help them do something about it?
Well, I think that China's ultimate objective is to get the Americans off the peninsula and to keep us distracted. And by having things sort of stay the way they are, it's worked out pretty well for them. Also, there's a huge constituency in the US that thinks we must have China's help on North Korea, therefore we cannot challenge them on anything else, or we have to accommodate them. That hasn't played out very well. But I think, as Doug has said, it's that relationship between the Koreans and China is an interesting one, and there's no great love lost in most quarters. But at the same time, I think the Chinese and the North Koreans are able to cooperate for certain purposes. One interesting approach would be for the Americans to just go all out on be friends with North Korea, open an office there, just say, okay, we understand you've got nuclear weapons, et cetera, et cetera. And that would discombobulate the Chinese somewhat, I should think. That would be a real change. Don't think I would support it. I would prefer to get rid of the Kim family criminal enterprise. I think the Koreans are capable of more than a regime like that. But that's just me. But to split that, to work on that North Korean China relationship, that's a tricky one. But it's worth considering.
Bruce?
Well, great comments by both Doug and Grant. They neither one of them said anything I disagree with, but I will say this. I'd just like everyone to think about past precedent. I mean, I'm a political science professor and I come up with lots of fancy theories, but you don't need any fancy theories to understand North Korea's behavior since the end of the Cold War. Literally since the end of the Cold War, since about 1993, before the agreed framework was signed, we were asking China to help us. Every single presidential administration, except for President Trump, including the one now, has said, we're going to get China to help us put pressure on North Korea. And every single time that we've dealt with North Korea and China, China has gone out of their way to protect North Korea and keep us from getting too far. That is without precedent. That is completely what has happened every time, no matter who our president was, no matter what the issue was, but it's typically been nuclear and ballistic missile stuff. So I would just say China, as Grant said, he used a very good term, status quo. China wants the status quo. They like having the buffer state between the only U.S. forces on the mainland of Asia that would be on their border if there was a unified Korea. At least that's how the government in Beijing thinks. Of course, we know, especially Doug and Grant know, that if there was a unified Korea, how many weeks would it take for the Rock government to ask American troops to leave? Days. But that is, China is there. They will protect North Korea in their minds, the mind of the Politburo, as they have to. They're going to look out for their own national interests and those of North Korea, not what we're looking for.
On a related program called the Washington Brief, it's sponsored by the Washington Times Foundation, Ambassador Detrani and Ambassador Christopher Hill both stated that we cannot cave in on the complete verifiable denuclearization. And I noticed the irreversible has been dropped out of most discussions. So what do you think about that? Can we hold on? I'd like to ask all three of you to comment, and that'll be our last couple minutes. So what about CVD, complete verifiable denuclearization? Should America hold on to that? We hope so, but what do you think? Doug?
I would say hold on to it in theory, make that the ultimate objective, but basically proceed in a sense on an arms control basis. That is, try to get reasonable limitations along the way that are advantageous, that might move on the road towards denuclearization. I mean, I'm very skeptical they will ever give up their nuclear weapons, that there's some irreducible arsenal. My guess is they will want to keep, for security purposes, extortion purposes, domestic politics. It's a payoff to the military. I mean, there are lots of reasons. This is a Kim family achievement, any number of reasons. But there's at least a chance that we could convince them to cap a program, to limit, and I would proceed trying to make those kinds of differences that are helpful, that at the margin might reduce the danger while holding on to the objective of full denuclearization.
Thank you. Grant?
I think it's okay to have this is the objective, the stated objective, but you have to, only if you're willing to do the things that are necessary to give you a fair chance of bringing it about. And if you're not, then don't even bother saying it. But the two have to follow each other. And I haven't seen that we have done the things that would apply the necessary pressure to bring the North Koreans around. And not unfortunately, but it is a regime for which I've got no great love, and I wouldn't mind seeing it going away. And I'm not sure that until it goes away, we have much chance of actually getting them to give up or reduce their nuclear weapons.
Thank you. Bruce, final comment?
Well, thanks. I agree with everything my two colleagues said. I would just like to point out something that is important to remember, and that's the word verification. Verification is when everything ended. Remember when the Bush administration said that they were going to dismantle their program? Aha! What about when it came to verification? That's when it ended. They found a reason to end it. And another thing, getting back to past precedent has shown us just having them freeze their program means nothing. because they can simply unfreeze it. Well, how do we know they're going to do that? Because they've done it already. So I would say it's very important as a goal for the United States government, as a policy goal, to have complete, and I'll go ahead and use the verifiable principle, to completely, for North Korea to completely dismantle its nuclear program. Do I think they will ever transparently, verifiably ever do that? Boy, that I see nothing that would put enough pressure on them to make them do that. We've tried a lot of things, but thus far that has not happened. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you all very much. It's been a great program. Our time's run out. Larry, final comment? for next
Yes,
week?
thank you, Dr. Jenkins. Thanks, all of you gentlemen. Whenever we get these three geopolitical experts in the room, I am always seeing the giant pieces moving on this big game of Go in that region, and it's a very sobering topic. Next week, July 27 coincides with the 68th anniversary of the armistice that was signed in Korea. And we're going to have a retrospective on that. It's going to be called Our Longest War, Thoughts on the 68th Anniversary of the Korean Armistice. We'll have Canadian economist Joseph Chung. We'll have Michael Breen and Joseph Zwelsloot, both two longtime Asian hands over in Korea, who are going to be working the coffee pot and staying up in the middle of the night to participate in that. It's going to be very interesting. All of them have had a hand in the media. Michael Breen was a former bureau chief for the Washington Times in Seoul. So that one's going to be sponsored by the International Media Association for Peace. And we're really looking forward to it. Hope everybody will tune in next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you.